Welcome to Hackriculture. Hackriculture is a website and a podcast about self-sufficiency. What I'm going to just cover first is the question, what is self-sufficiency? Because that's a term that has changed a lot over the decades. If you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, your standard definition of self-sufficiency was going off into the countryside, buying a big piece of land, hopefully with a cottage or somewhere to live on it as well, growing your own food, keeping animals, driving a tractor, cutting down trees for firewood, wearing a check shirt, all that sort of stuff. And that is the image of self-sufficiency that in many people's minds still persists today, although it died decades ago. The reason the self-sufficiency of the 60s and 70s, and maybe a bit into the 80s, didn't work for a lot of people is because that kind of lifestyle is extremely expensive. It takes a lot of money, particularly in Britain, and it takes a lot of time. And a lot of people don't have either of those things. I know I certainly don't. So what I want to do is to try and redefine self-sufficiency for the 21st century as something that just about any of us can do. It's, for me, much more of an urban thing now. There's probably less emphasis on the food growing side because one of the things that people who bought 10 acres of land found was that you can produce a ridiculous amount of food, far more than a family would need, but you're not big enough to be a farmer. So when you look at backyard growing, allotment growing, that sort of thing, you can actually find out you can produce most of your vegetables and fruit. It helps if you're a vegetarian. In a normal urban environment, you don't need that big farm. Another thing that I think is very relevant to modern day living is you've got to fit all these hobbies, because it is a hobby at the end of the day, around responsibilities such as family, work, socialising, all that sort of thing. So to summarise my view of modern self-sufficiency, there's less emphasis on the rural good life, less emphasis on producing ridiculous amounts of food, more emphasis on making self-sufficiency fit around an everyday lifestyle and a normal house, probably in a town, and just doing stuff that makes sense to help you live a bit more, I don't like to use the word sustainably, but a bit more independently. Let's put this in context a little bit. I was working about 8 years ago. I worked for an IT company. I was working in a place called Cornwall. It's about 6 miles to the west of here. And Cornwall is an ex-mining town. It used to be right at the heart of the copper belt, and there's tin mining there as well. Very, very rich place at the end of the 19th century. Very industrialised as well. Cornwall was one of the first places in England, that means one of the first places in the world, to industrialise. The high pressure steam engine was invented right there. So it's a very interesting place. And it's also, these days, very much a case study, a poster child even, for deindustrial Britain, because the last mine closed 30 years ago. There were quite a few engineering companies that were based around the mine. They also shut. So despite the fact it's still a very urbanised culture, a lot of people work, and they either are in skilled trades or would like to be in skilled trades. So they want to keep up their sort of industrial way of living, but they haven't got any industry to work in. So they tend to end up fixing video recorders for each other and doing sorts of stuff like that. But very creative people. Anyway, I was in we had a little office in Cornwall. It's 2 stories high, so we could actually look out over the whole place. And I was working with a chap from Hungary that came over. And he was about my age, actually, and a very, very thoughtful chap. He didn't always speak, but when he did, my friend would usually say something quite intelligent. And he turned to me one day. We were standing by the window looking out over Cornwall, and he said, "This place confuses me." He said, "I've been around the world quite a bit, and I know poverty when I see it." He said, he waved an expansive hand over the houses and everything out the window. He said, "These people are poor. and yet they don't do the things that poor people do in my country. I said, well, please explain. He said, well, firstly, they've all got gardens, somewhere they could grow food, but they don't. They don't have chickens, they don't have fruit trees, they just don't do any of the food production that we would do in a poor area in Hungary, in my hometown. He said that there's bits of land that aren't being used at all, that seem to either belong to no one or no one's got any interest in them. Why aren't they being cultivated by these people that could do more for themselves? And he said there's no foraging in the hedgerows. People don't seem to pick things in the autumn time and the summertime like they do. So why aren't these people that some of them do look very hard up, why aren't they doing more to help themselves? Why aren't they being more self-sufficient? And I said to him, well, I really don't have an explanation for that. I mean, I said, that's what you said is fair criticism. But does it help that Camborne was, and still is, an industrial town? And you're familiar with a more rural background. I'm not saying Hungary isn't industrial, but we had steam engines 200 years ago in this town, and people have just lost the habits that your people back in Hungary might have. And he nodded. He didn't necessarily agree with me. He didn't disagree with me, but I think he sort of understood a little bit about what deindustrialisation actually means in a culture like Britain. And I think he also pointed at something that is very relevant for people going forward, because, yeah, is there a future in an urban culture like our own, and deindustrialising culture like our own? Is there a future fixing each other's cars and video recorders? Well, there is. But could we discover more of the things that my friend explained, that people have as second nature? Could we do more to help ourselves? Now we don't have so many big factories and jobs and things like that. And the answer is pretty much yes. This is the challenge of deindustrialisation. And deindustrial Britain doesn't have to be a grim place where people scrub around in the mud, but it does have to be a place where people become more self-reliant. The habits of our ancestors, if you like, growing food, keeping animals at home, maybe going out, cutting your own fuel, doing the things that your ancestors used to do, but has been kind of forgotten. I mean, it's 8-9 generations since industrialisation. It's a long, long time, and there's stuff that people have forgotten. So to get back to my vision of self-sufficiency, it's something that people used to do back in the 60s and 70s. They had a very unrealistic idea of how to live off the land. Most of the self-sufficiency projects failed, but all the information is still there in the books that were written in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, books about self-sufficiency, books about how to produce your own food, perhaps on a smaller area than was envisaged by some of the authors, but you can do it. Fixing up your own house to be more energy efficient, insulation, that sort of thing. Making energy at home. Well, we have a lot more kit in the way of solar, for instance. Solar panels are very much cheaper than they were in the 70s, so we can certainly do that side of it. We can make do and we can do a lot of things to help ourselves and still have an affluent lifestyle. The more we depend on a society around us that doesn't provide us with the jobs and the living that it once used to, the more we should look to ourselves to be independent. So I think there's a future for self-sufficiency, a bright future, certainly in places like Britain, and I intend to prove it with these videos.